So now that we've finished kind of looking at the Constitution and we have a sense that the Constitution was not this, like, it created unity, but it created unity out of disunity. Like, I think that's a really important concept to grasp, which is that these men like Washington and Hamilton and Madison and Patrick Henry and all these guys, they realize that the country is struggling and that the country is having issues. Now, some people feel like things will get better. We just need to stay the course. Other people feel like we need a rehaul. Well, the rehaul wins, right? These economic interests, these kinds of things. And understand, it doesn't, because I say there's economic interest, that's not to suggest that these are bad things. You don't necessarily want, like, this is the dilemma. This is what James Madison had studied throughout history, which is that, popular democracies and, small republics can very quickly devolve into kind of chaos and anarchy and really what is, just kind of this kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? This kind of uncontrolled situation, right? So having economic interests that say we need stability, we need systems in place, that can be a good thing. Compare that like as a kid, right? We don't let 3-year-olds run the house because then you eat ice cream and cookies all the time. And that's bad for you. Somebody needs to say, no, you have to eat your vegetables. No, you have to go to bed. And it's the same way with governance. Somebody has to say, okay, I'm the grown-up in the room. These are the things we have to do because this is what we have to do. And we may not like it and it may not be fun, but this is the way it's got to be. How do we do the most good for the most people? Think about the Federalist 10 and how James Madison actually referred to this notion, right? James Madison actually talks about it. I'm trying to look at the actual quote. Where he talks about the fact that, that having the most good, promoting the most good for people. Where is it? Oh, well, I can't find it off the top of my head. Anyways, but yes, look through Federalist 10. You'll see what he's talking about. So we end up with this Constitution. And now we've got a new nation. And what does it mean to be a nation? How does this government function, practically speaking, right? And so I think this quote down here at the bottom of this opening slide, the men who started the war for independence now face the reality of managing a nation. And growing up is hard to do even for a country. You can have lots of great ideals when you're a kid and have lots of ideas about how things should really be done. But that doesn't mean that that's how you get to do things for the rest of your life. So understand that Washington was unanimously elected. There was no debate. Washington's a pretty great, and I used to not be such a big fan. I used to kind of be neutral on Washington. But after going on a presidential heritage trip and really kind of reading about him, because as one of the requirements for this trip, truly, he was an amazing, amazing, amazing human being. And the fact that he was put on this earth during this time frame, to me, is proof that, of the divine hand, if you will. So Washington's very clearly elected. So you're going to see they have these 4-year terms. He will only serve 2 terms. This will establish the 2-term tradition that will hold until you get to FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, Great Depression, World War II, if you don't already know. Now, we'll mention when we talk about Teddy Roosevelt, we'll touch on this idea of the 2-term tradition. And so just kind of keep in mind what this means and kind of this debate about how many terms somebody should serve in office. John Adams is his vice president. Of course, the vice presidency, one of the frustrations John Adams will have is that the vice presidency doesn't do a whole lot. And George Washington, who, again, is an interesting person, really kind of freezes John Adams out. And so if you've ever, David McCullough has a good book on John Adams. There's a good HBO miniseries about him. And it's kind of interesting. You kind of feel bad for the dude. You have the Secretary of Treasury is Alexander Hamilton, so cue up your Hamilton musical stuff. You've got your Secretary of State is Thomas Jefferson, and he establishes some other positions, your Secretary of War, your Attorney General, that kind of thing. So those positions are part of the president's cabinet. And Washington really approaches his role as the president as somebody who is establishing what the president does. In fact, Washington feels a real strong burden to establish the traditions of the presidency and how the presidency is supposed to function and what it's supposed to look like and that kind of thing. So I think it's very important for you to recognize, that Washington is the one who really kind of set our expectations. So when we talk about what presidents do or don't do to meet kind of what defines a president, remember that Washington set the initial template. The judiciary, I've mentioned before, is largely undefined, or I think I've mentioned before. You'll have one of the first, Article 3 of the Constitution is the judiciary, but it's very broad and very general. So they have to actually pass the Judiciary Act of 1789 in order to kind of formulate kind of the federal court system. And it won't be until Marbury v. Madison in 1803, 1801, something like that. And that Marbury v. Madison ruling will be the one that will establish judicial review, and the idea that the Supreme Court actually doesn't have enforcement powers, but does basically say this is not constitutional. They kind of have the final say. So that's going to develop over time, so we'll be talking about that later on. Some of the documents we'll look at in class will involve the farewell address. Matter of fact, one of the other kind of extra videos that I'll share with you is about the farewell address. That's a very important thing for you to understand, especially given understanding in context of Federalist 10 and an understanding with the competing visions of the new nation assignment that you're going to be given. So you don't necessarily have to read the entire farewell address, but you need to understand what Washington is saying. And again, Washington tries to be very neutral through the tensions that are emerging, because you've got this pesky thing called the French Revolution that is erupting, and I kind of shared that as kind of an optional video for you guys because the French Revolution is a backdrop for the United States really from 1787, 1788 all the way until you get to roughly, I would say, 1820. So this is a major foreign policy situation, and it shapes what happens here at home in a lot of very odd ways. And so it's kind of good to have a sense of what's happening with the French Revolution. You don't have to know a whole bunch about it, but a little bit. Again, keep in mind that he definitely heavily influenced by Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was his aide-de-camp. They were very close, had a very tight relationship. And so Alexander Hamilton had a profound influence. Now, Washington liked James Madison to some extent. He relied on James Madison to write several of his most famous speeches, but at the same time, he doesn't like this development of political parties, and he really sees Madison and Jefferson as being ill-advised, I guess you could say. But it's interesting to kind of study Madison and Washington together, because Madison, they had a good relationship in the creation of the Constitution and right after. What becomes a problem is when this political party system begins to create fractures, and Washington really gets frustrated with the way Madison participates and the way Madison kind of gets down and dirty in politics. And for Washington, he tries to stay above all that, and so that's going to fracture his relationship with Madison. But again, all kinds of interesting personalities going on here. We do have an economic crisis. You should have kind of picked up on that from our activity with the Constitution. The sense that that bonds are a big problem, that we need to kind of fix our national credit. So Alexander Hamilton, as the Secretary of the Treasury, you'll be reading about some of his ideas about the economy. And again, this is a unique dude. Most of us now, a few years ago, nobody understood the background of Alexander Hamilton. Now, thanks to Lin-Manuel Miranda, or Lin-Miranda-Manuel, however his name goes, everyone knows a little bit about Alexander Hamilton. So we know he comes from the Caribbean. We know he was heavily involved with trade. He's got a really good economic mind. He also is tied to New York, so he values manufacturing and merchants and trades and all that kind of stuff. And what his assertion is that the federal government needs to assume all the debts from the Revolutionary War. And that then they will rely on controlling trade and tariffs and a few kind of tariff-based kind of taxation tools to make up the money to pay back their credit. And really the foundation of his idea is that well-managed debt is good for you. And the best way I can explain this is consider the difference between buying a house, right? You buy a house and you go into debt. I mean, however expensive your house is, you owe that money. But typically speaking, a house, real estate, is considered good debt because it has value and it holds its value pretty much. And so you're actually, ultimately, it should be gaining in value. So going into debt for real estate is perceived as a solid investment. Sometimes people say going into debt for education can be a solid investment, and I think that depends on I think there's nuances to that, but certainly generally speaking, going into debt, taking out student loans can be a positive if it's well managed, and that emphasis on well managed. Compare those things as opposed to buying a car, for instance. Cars get used up, they wear out, they don't hold their value. Going out to eat. You swipe a credit card to pay for a dinner and then you make the minimum payments on it. You're paying interest on food you've already digested. Or if you're talking about a car payment, you're paying interest on a car that has already lost its value. So you're paying interest on money that you can't ever reclaim. So those are not good debts. So there's a difference between good debt and bad debt. And what Alexander Hamilton says is that well-managed good debt is healthy for the economy. So he asserts that the federal government can go borrow the money, pay back all of the bonds, get the economy on a solid footing, and then rely on tariffs and taxation on trade as a way of making their loan payments. And once those loans are paid off, then they'll have a good credit rating and everything will be better. Well, that's all well and good, of course, except that we've got all these regional differences, and the regional differences are going to create tensions. There's also lots of questions about creation of a Bank of the United States. Notice here I reference that as bus 1. There'll be a bus 2, a Bank of the United States 2, when we get to Andrew Jackson. So this is the first Bank of the United States. And again, they're talking about having tariffs to protect domestic manufacturing. Tariffs are taxes on imported goods. So if I have a factory that makes shoes, for instance, then basically shoes from England will cost more than my shoes because of the tariff, and that gives me a price advantage on my shoes. And that can even allow for quality differences and that kind of thing. So tariffs are meant to protect manufacturing. You need to have a foundational understanding of what a tariff is. We'll be talking about tariffs a lot for basically the rest of the year until we get to the creation of the income tax. So you want to know what a tariff is. He's got this excise tax on whiskey. Understand that farmers up in Ohio and up in the Midwest that had crossed over the Appalachian Mountains, they're sitting there, they're growing grain, and because it's so difficult to transport, we don't have infrastructure in place. So they're sending a lot of this stuff downriver. And by sending it downriver, the easiest way to do this is in whiskey barrels. And so Alexander Hamilton has this idea of taxing whiskey, which is going to upset a bunch of farmers because they feel like it's a tax targeted directly to them, as opposed to the manufacturers. In other words, the manufacturers are getting a break because of tariffs, but the farmers are paying an extra tax. That dilemma right there is going to continue throughout most of U.S. history. And so you're going to have major splits. You had people like Madison and Hamilton working together to get the Constitution passed. This issue over the creation of the Bank of the United States, this issue over tariffs and excise taxes are going to become real divisive elements, right, between people that maybe favored a strong central government to create security, but now they're looking at the system and they're going, wait a minute, that's too much government. This isn't authorized. This is taking it too far. And you have people like Madison and even Jefferson who maybe wasn't a huge fan of the Constitution, but certainly did not openly oppose the Constitution. But they're going to get real upset about the National Bank. They're going to say this is not authorized. We don't have the power to do this. And Hamilton's going to counter that Congress does have the power to do this because of the necessary and proper clause that's attached to Article 1. That basically Congress can do what is necessary and proper. And he says these are implied powers, that the legislative branch has implied powers they can then use. So you have this kind of stretching of the Constitution almost immediately after the thing is written. And I cannot emphasize that enough, because this question about strict interpretation of the Constitution or loose interpretation of the Constitution is profoundly important for the 20th and 21st century. Just right now, over gerrymandering, you have a debate in the Supreme Court about how to interpret the Constitution. And did the Founding Fathers ever, does the Constitution even cover an issue like gerrymandering? Well, that's a strict interpretation. And a lot of people who call themselves strict interpretationists or originalists will go back to this idea, well, we're supposed to interpret the Constitution as it was written. But I would counter that no, because right out of the gate, you already have people talking about interpretation. Well, okay, the Constitution really means this. It's necessary and proper. We can create a Bank of the United States. We can do these things. So understand that this question about interpreting the Constitution goes back to the Founding Fathers themselves. And so to me, that answers the question about originalist intent. And basically it's meant to be interpreted based on the circumstances. And essentially what you have here is a backroom deal between Madison and Jefferson to basically say, okay, fine, we'll rubber stamp your whole bank idea as long as you make sure the new national capital's in the South. So this is why Washington, D.C. is right there between Virginia and Maryland, and not, say, in New York or someplace that used to be a really big city. That's because what's happening is that they made this deal to have the capital where they wanted it to be. And so I think it's very important for you to kind of understand that even Madison and Jefferson, for all that they thought that, if you were talking about originalist intent, even though they were like, well, I don't think we can make a Bank of the United States, they negotiated on it. And I think that's an incredibly important lesson. Again, if you're trying to understand what the Founding Fathers really, really thought, you also have this continuation and really a solidification of agrarian interests versus urban interests. The idea of farmers versus manufacturers, remote areas versus urban areas. And that debate is going to continue. That debate continues today. You can look at the 2016 election and see that. That we have cities that vote one way, whereas the rest of the state will vote some other way. So these are very real divisions that we've had always, always, always. All right, so I'm going to stop this here because I've gone on like 18 minutes and kind of break this apart so you don't have to